Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The shadow in the hallway.
I still remember my first night shift at St. Mary's Hospital as if it were yesterday. I had just graduated and landed my dream job, but the nerves were eating me alive. The hospital, with its old brick walls and flickering lights, had a reputation. Some called it haunted, while others insisted it was just a bunch of superstitions. I tried to laugh it off, but the moment I stepped through those doors, I felt a chill settle deep in my bones. As I was briefed on my responsibilities, the other nurses shared ghost stories about the third floor, claiming that strange things happened there at night. They urged me to stay away and promised I'd get used to the peculiar noises, but I brushed it off, eager to prove myself. After all, I was a nurse now. How scary could it be? The night dragged on, and my fatigue began to set in. I moved from room to room, checking on patients, ensuring they were comfortable. As the clock struck midnight, I felt an unsettling sensation in the air, like a heavy fog creeping in. It was then that I first saw it, a dark shadow lingering at the end of the corridor, just beyond the flickering fluorescent lights. My heart raced as I squinted, trying to convince myself it was merely a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. I shook my head and focused on my work, but the shadow wouldn't leave me alone. I could feel it, lurking just out of sight, watching me. I took a deep breath and decided to check on a patient in room 308, forcing myself to concentrate on the task at hand. The moment I turned my back, I felt a chill wash over me, and a shiver ran down my spine. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. "You're just tired." But as I walked back to the nurse's station, the shadow returned, more pronounced this time. I could swear it seemed to shift, as if it was trying to communicate something. Ignoring it was becoming increasingly difficult. With every glance, I felt a pull, an invitation to step closer. I glanced at the clock. My shift would be over in just a few hours. I couldn't let a mere shadow get to me. That night, as I tucked the last patient into bed, I vowed I wouldn't let my imagination run wild. But when I stepped into the hallway again, the shadow was there, waiting. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, it felt like the shadow was not just a trick of the mind. It was something else, something darker, and it wanted my attention. Every night after that first shift, the shadow seemed to follow me, lurking just beyond my line of sight. It was as if it knew I was trying to ignore it, and the more I tried to pretend it wasn't there, the more persistent it became. I found myself looking over my shoulder at every creak of the floorboards or flicker of the lights, my heart racing at the slightest disturbance. During my shifts, I confided in Sarah, one of the nurses who had been working at St. Mary's for years. I told her about the shadow, my voice barely above a whisper. She laughed it off, but I could see a flicker of unease in her eyes. "Oh, that's just the ghost of Nurse Elizabeth," she said, her tone light but her expression serious. "She's been hanging around here for years. Don't worry, she's harmless." "Harmless," I echoed, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "How do you know?" "Just a feeling," Sarah shrugged, but I could tell she was holding something back. "You'll get used to it. Just ignore her." Easier said than done. The shadow continued to haunt me night after night. It was always at the end of the hallway, just outside the reach of the flickering lights. The darkness seemed to wrap around it like a cloak, and I couldn't help but feel drawn to it, despite the fear gripping my chest. One particularly long night, I was assigned to monitor the patients on the third floor, where the atmosphere felt different, heavier somehow. I moved from room to room, my senses on high alert. As I approached the end of the hallway, I spotted the shadow once again, standing motionless. It seemed to pulse with energy, and I felt a strange compulsion to step closer. "Just get it over with," I muttered under my breath, trying to gather my courage. As I approached, the air turned frigid, and I felt a wave of sorrow wash over me. It was overwhelming, as if I could sense the pain and despair that lingered in the very walls of the hospital. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, just silence. But as I reached the spot where the shadow had been standing, I felt a sudden gust of wind rush past me, making the hairs on my arms stand up. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there, only the darkened hallway stretching behind me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. "It's just your imagination," I told myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I was no longer sure what I was dealing with, and each encounter left me more shaken than the last. As my shift wore on, I could hear whispers echoing through the halls, drifting just beyond my hearing. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was chilling, filled with sadness and longing. I felt the shadow's presence growing stronger, as if it were feeding off my fear. By the end of the night, I was exhausted and on edge. I confided in Sarah again, but she dismissed my concerns, telling me to just focus on my job. Frustrated, I resolved to keep a closer eye on the shadow. I had to understand what it wanted, even if it meant confronting my deepest fears. As the nights passed, I became increasingly obsessed with the shadow. Each encounter left me more unsettled, and I began to dread the thought of going back to work. My colleagues noticed my growing unease, but I brushed off their concerns, too embarrassed to admit that I was scared of a shadow. I told myself that I was a nurse, trained to handle far worse than a mere figment of my imagination. But deep down, I felt the weight of something sinister lurking in the darkness. One evening, during my shift, I stood at the nurses' station, fighting the urge to glance down the hallway. I could sense it there, waiting for me. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously, and I felt an inexplicable chill in the air. My resolve wavered as I prepared to head back to my assigned rooms. That's when I overheard a conversation between two nurses in the break room. They were talking about a patient on the third floor, a woman who had been admitted for severe depression. Her condition had worsened, and they were unable to reach her. The nurses whispered that the woman had begun to talk to the shadows, convinced they were real. Maybe she's seeing the same thing I am, I thought, my heart racing. Maybe there's something to this. I decided to investigate. I made my way to the third floor, determined to confront the shadow and find out what it wanted. As I stepped into the hallway, the familiar coldness enveloped me, and I could almost feel the shadow's eyes on me. I took a deep breath and walked toward the end of the corridor, where the shadow often lingered. To my surprise, the shadow appeared to be shifting and swirling, almost like it was alive. I felt my pulse quicken as I approached it, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But something compelled me to keep going. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The shadow seemed to pulse in response, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure, an outline of a woman, with long hair that cascaded around her shoulders. She looked at me, her eyes dark and hollow, filled with an emptiness that sent shivers down my spine. I was paralyzed by fear, unable to move or look away. Suddenly, the figure reached out, and I felt a rush of emotion wash over me. Sorrow, regret, and an overwhelming sense of despair. It was as if the shadow was trying to convey something to me, something important. I wanted to step closer, to understand, but my instincts screamed for me to run. In that moment, the lights flickered violently, and I stumbled back, crashing into the wall. The shadow retreated, merging back into the darkness, leaving me breathless and shaken. I glanced around, my heart pounding in my chest. Had anyone seen that? Did anyone else feel it? I rushed back to the nurse's station, my mind racing. I needed answers. I grabbed Sarah and pulled her aside, my voice urgent. What happened to the patient on the 3rd floor? The one who was talking to the shadows? Sarah's expression turned serious. She didn't make it. Died a few nights ago. They said she was in so much pain, she just let go. The words hung heavy in the air. It felt like a confirmation of my fears. What if that shadow is her? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What if she's trying to reach out? Sarah looked at me with a mix of concern and confusion. Listen, you need to stop thinking about this. It's not good for you. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow connected to the shadow. I had to know what it wanted before it consumed me too. The nights grew longer, and I felt myself slipping further into a spiral of paranoia and dread. The shadow had become a constant presence, an unwelcome companion in my mind. Each time I walked down that corridor, I half expected to see the figure waiting for me, ready to pull me into the darkness. I stopped sleeping well, haunted by nightmares of that hollow-eyed woman reaching out to me, begging for something I couldn't understand. I confided in Sarah again, desperation creeping into my voice. I have to know more about her. The patient who died. Do you have any details? Sarah hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. You need to let this go. It's not healthy, and it's not worth it. People come and go in hospitals, and some leave more than just memories behind. Please, I urged. Just tell me her name. After a moment, she relented. Her name was Lily. She was only 23. Young, bright, and then she just fell apart. They say she lost her battle against her demons. The name echoed in my mind as I returned to my duties, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to confront the shadow again. I needed to understand what Lily wanted from me, and more importantly, if there was anything I could do to help her find peace. That night, as the clock struck midnight, I braced myself for another encounter. I walked slowly down the dimly lit hallway, every sound amplified in the silence. The air felt heavy, charged with an unexplainable energy. As I approached the end of the corridor, the shadow emerged, more defined than ever before. Lily, I whispered, my voice shaking. Are you here? The shadow flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the outline of a face. A soft sob echoed through the hallway, chilling me to my core. Help me, it seemed to say, though the words were more felt than heard. What do you need? I called out, my heart racing. I want to help you. The shadow surged toward me, and I stumbled back, almost losing my footing. In that moment, a rush of memories flooded my mind. Images of a girl crying in a hospital bed, surrounded by doctors who seemed to look through her instead of at her. I felt her pain as if it were my own, the weight of her loneliness and despair crushing me. I steadied myself against the wall, overwhelmed by the connection we shared. You're not alone, Lily, I said softly. I'm here. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently again, and the temperature dropped drastically. I could feel the energy shifting, and in an instant, the hallway felt suffocating. The shadow reached out, and I could feel a rush of sorrow wash over me. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry you suffered." The figure paused, and I felt a flicker of warmth in the coldness. "Help me find peace," it urged, its voice echoing in my mind. Before I could respond, the lights went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me as I struggled to catch my breath. "Lily!" I shouted, but the silence was deafening. The darkness wrapped around me like a shroud, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. In that moment, I realized the truth. Lily wasn't just a shadow. She was a soul trapped in a limbo of pain, unable to move on. I had to find a way to help her. I stood in the suffocating darkness, panic tightening its grip around my chest. "Lily!" I called out again, desperation clawing at my throat. I could feel her presence, but the shadows enveloped me like a living entity, threatening to swallow me whole. Just when I thought I would lose myself to fear, a soft glow began to illuminate the corridor, cutting through the suffocating darkness. As the light grew brighter, I felt a surge of courage. I couldn't let fear dictate my actions any longer. I had to help Lily. I took a deep breath and stepped toward the light, feeling an inexplicable pull guiding me forward. "Lily, I want to help you find peace." I shouted into the darkness, my voice echoing with determination. "Please, just show me how." The shadow responded, the swirling darkness beginning to take shape once more. I could see the outline of the girl, her eyes still hollow, but the expression on her face was softer now, almost pleading. It felt as if she were trying to convey something important, something I needed to understand. Suddenly, a vision flashed in my mind, a scene from the past, of Lily in her hospital bed, surrounded by doctors and nurses who were too busy to notice her cries for help. I saw her fear and loneliness, a feeling so familiar to me. It was a reminder that even in the most crowded places, one can feel utterly alone. Tears streamed down my face as the realization hit me. "You felt invisible," I murmured, my heart aching for her. "You wanted someone to see you, to listen." The shadow trembled, and I felt a connection that was almost tangible. "You are not invisible anymore, Lily," I vowed, my voice filled with emotion. "I see you, and I will not forget you." In that moment, the glow around me intensified, enveloping both of us. The darkness began to dissipate, revealing a pathway of light. I reached out my hand, feeling an overwhelming urge to guide her toward the light. "Come with me," I urged. "It's okay to let go. You deserve peace." As I extended my hand, the shadow began to melt away, revealing the contours of a young woman bathed in ethereal light. Lily looked at me, her expression transforming from despair to something resembling hope. Slowly, she reached for my hand. The moment our fingers touched, I felt a rush of warmth wash over me. It was as if all of her pain, her fears, and her sorrows were released in that instant. The air around us sparkled with a golden light, and I could feel her presence fading, yet somehow lighter and freer. "I'm here," I whispered, tears blurring my vision. "You're not alone anymore." With that, she smiled softly before disappearing into the light, leaving me standing in the now brightened corridor. The shadows had lifted, and the oppressive weight that had haunted me for nights was finally gone. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief and clarity wash over me. I knew I had to share Lily's story with others, to ensure that no one else would suffer in silence. I had witnessed the consequences of ignoring the cries for help, and I would not let her memory fade away. That night, as I walked back to the nurse's station, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I would be the nurse who listened, who saw, and who cared. And every time I walked that hallway, I would remember Lily, the girl who taught me the importance of compassion and connection, even in the darkest of places.
Beware of medication.
I remember waking up in a haze, my senses dulled by the heavy fog of anesthesia. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the sterile hospital room. I blinked slowly, trying to adjust to my surroundings, but everything felt surreal. My body was sore, and I could feel the sharp tug of bandages wrapped tightly around my torso, reminders of the surgery I'd just undergone. As I lay there, my mind struggled to piece together the events that led me to this moment. A simple procedure, they said. I had hoped for nothing more than a quick recovery, but as I surveyed the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The door creaked open, and in walked a nurse dressed in crisp scrubs, her face partially hidden behind a mask. She had a calm demeanor, but there was an unsettling quality to her. "How are we feeling today?" she asked, her voice smooth and soothing. I wanted to answer, to say that I felt a little better, but instead, I just nodded. I couldn't see her eyes clearly, but I felt them studying me, almost as if she were gauging my every reaction. She moved about the room with practiced ease, checking my for and making notes on my chart. It was all very routine, but the atmosphere felt heavy, as if the air was charged with an unseen energy. After a moment, she approached my bedside and adjusted the drip. "You'll be feeling better soon," she said, her lips curling into a tight smile. I wanted to believe her, but there was something about her smile that made me uneasy. It felt predatory, like she was savoring my vulnerability. Once she left, I tried to shake off the unease that lingered in my chest. I focused on the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, counting each beat, willing myself to relax. But the sounds morphed into something else, a whispering that danced at the edge of my consciousness, teasing me with half-formed words that faded before I could grasp them. Night fell, and the hospital transformed. Shadows crept along the walls, flickering in the corners of my vision. I told myself it was just my imagination, the residual effects of the medication clouding my mind. But as I drifted in and out of fitful sleep, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. And then, I saw her again, the nurse. She was making her rounds, gliding through the dimly lit corridor. But this time, she moved differently. There was no soft clatter of shoes against the floor, no rustling of scrubs. It was as if she was gliding, her feet barely touching the ground. I blinked, convinced that the shadows were playing tricks on me. But when I focused again, she was still there, standing at the end of the hall, watching. I felt my heart race as a chill crept up my spine. Why was she here so late? Shouldn't she be in the staff room, tending to other patients? I shut my eyes tightly, willing myself to ignore her presence. Perhaps I was just too tired, too medicated to process what was real and what wasn't. But as I drifted back into a restless sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The days blurred together as I continued my recovery. Each morning, I awoke to the same sterile environment, and every night brought the same haunting darkness. My routine became predictable. Pain medications administered by the same shadowy nurse, who appeared each evening without fail. But as my body healed, my mind began to unravel. It started innocently enough. I began to notice small things about her. She never spoke more than necessary, and her eyes seemed to hold a glint of something unsettling. The way she looked at me was almost as if she were assessing me, weighing my worth. Each time she entered my room, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. One night, I was drifting in and out of sleep when I felt her presence before I saw her. The familiar sensation of being watched washed over me. I opened my eyes slowly to find her standing by my bedside, administering my medication with a practiced precision. She looked at me, her face still masked, but I could feel her eyes boring into mine. "It's time for your medication," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, staring at the small syringe in her hand. "What is that?" I asked, my throat dry and my voice raspy. "It's just your pain medication," she replied, her smile unwavering. But something about her tone sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Each time I took the medication from her, I felt a gnawing doubt clawing at my mind. What if she was giving me something more? I had heard stories of patients being treated like experiments, their trust exploited by those sworn to help them. I couldn't let that happen to me. As I lay in bed that night, I watched the shadows dance along the walls. They seemed to morph into grotesque shapes, whispering secrets I couldn't decipher. I gripped the sheets, heart pounding, as I struggled to distinguish between reality and the nightmares that crept into my consciousness. In a moment of panic, I decided to keep track of my medication. I reached for a pen and began to jot down the times and dosages in a small notebook I found on my bedside table. As I documented each administration, the fear within me escalated. Why was I feeling more disoriented each day? Was it truly the medication, or was it something else entirely? Then came the hallucinations. At first, they were fleeting, faces peering out from the corners of the room, twisted and distorted, mouths frozen in silent screams. I would blink and they'd vanish, but the fear lingered, pooling in the pit of my stomach. I had to know if it was real. One night, as the nurse entered, I gathered the courage to confront her. "Are you sure you're giving me the right medication?" I asked, my voice trembling. She paused, her smile faltering for just a moment. "Of course, dear. Just relax. You need to trust me," she replied, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. It was then that I noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she prepared the syringe. As she administered the dose, I felt a wave of warmth wash over me, but it quickly turned to dread. Was she watching me, waiting to see how I would react? My heart raced as I tried to shake off the feeling of paranoia, but it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew with each passing day. That night, I experienced the worst hallucinations yet. I woke up to find the room shrouded in darkness, the machines beeping a frantic rhythm. And there she was, the nurse, standing by the window, her back to me. I called out to her, but she didn't turn. Instead, I saw shadows swirling around her, twisting into dark shapes, and panic surged through me. I bolted upright, adrenaline coursing through my veins. "What are you doing?" I shouted, but she remained still, almost as if she were in a trance. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was witnessing. Suddenly she turned, and for a brief moment I caught a glimpse of her face. But it was wrong. Her features seemed to shift and distort, a grotesque mask grinning at me from the darkness. The lights flickered, and I felt the ground beneath me begin to tremble. With my sanity unraveling, I knew I had to find a way out of this nightmare. The nurse was no longer just a caregiver. She was something far more sinister. I had to escape before it was too late. The next day, I woke with a heavy fog in my mind, the remnants of the previous night's terror clinging to me like a shroud. My heart was still racing, and I could feel the sweat pooling in the small of my back. I had to find a way to stay awake, to fight the drowsiness that her medication forced upon me. If I closed my eyes again, who knew what I would see? I couldn't shake the feeling that the nurse was watching me, studying my every move. Each time I caught a glimpse of her, I felt a shiver run down my spine. She'd glide through the room like a shadow, her presence always lingering just out of sight. I forced myself to eat a meager breakfast, my stomach twisted in knots. I had to keep my strength up, but the food felt like lead in my gut. I resolved to confront my fears head-on. I decided to alert the medical staff about the strange happenings and the odd nurse who seemed to haunt my nights. My first opportunity came when a doctor entered my room, clipboard in hand. I took a deep breath and spoke up. "Can you tell me about the night shift nurses? There's one who—" Before I could finish, he interrupted me with a dismissive wave. "The night staff are experienced. You just need to rest and trust them." His eyes didn't meet mine, and I felt a wave of frustration wash over me. How could they not see what was happening? That evening, the nurse returned, her presence as unsettling as ever. I decided to keep quiet for now, biding my time, watching her like a hawk. She approached with the familiar syringe in hand, and I steeled myself. "What's in that?" I asked, my voice strained but determined. "It's just your medication," she replied smoothly, but her smile sent chills racing through me. I felt the walls closing in. "You need it to recover, sweetheart. Don't fight it." But I had to fight. I wasn't sure what was happening to me, but I could feel the very edges of my sanity fraying. I needed proof of her deception, something to show the doctors that I wasn't imagining things. As the night wore on, I devised a plan. I would stay awake, and when she came to administer my medication, I would make sure to observe everything closely. I knew I could not trust my mind. I had to gather evidence of her strange behavior. Hours crawled by, and eventually, the fluorescent lights flickered on, bathing the room in an eerie glow. The nurse entered, and I feigned sleep, my heart pounding in my chest. I peered through barely opened eyelids as she approached. Her movements were fluid, almost hypnotic. She adjusted my fore and prepared the syringe, her back turned to me. I glanced at the clock. 12:15 a.m. It felt like an eternity had passed. Just as she was about to inject me, I quickly turned my head and blurted out, "Wait, I need to see it first." Her eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of annoyance cross her face. "You don't need to see it, it's all in your chart," she replied, her tone sharper than before. But I pressed on, desperate for answers. "Please, just let me see it. I want to know what you're giving me." After what felt like an eternity, she sighed and placed the syringe on the table beside me. I grabbed it, shaking hands, fumbling to read the label. I felt a mix of relief and terror when I recognized the medication. It was supposed to be just a pain reliever. But why was she always so evasive? As I looked back up at her, I noticed something odd. A flicker of a shadow moving behind her, almost as if something were trying to break free. My pulse quickened as I blinked, and suddenly the shadow vanished, replaced by the calm mask she wore. "Are you satisfied now?" she asked, irritation creeping into her voice. "Yeah, but—" I began, but she cut me off. "Then just take your medication and rest," she said, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "You need your strength for what's to come." That phrase echoed in my mind long after she left the room. What did she mean by what's to come? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in deeper trouble than I had imagined. Unable to sleep, I spent the rest of the night plotting my next move. I couldn't trust her or the medications she administered. I had to find a way to escape this nightmare, but how? As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the window, I realized that time was running out. I could feel the darkness creeping back in, whispering its sinister promises. I needed to act, and I needed to act fast before the nurse decided I was nothing more than another experiment in her twisted game. The next morning, I felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. I knew I had to confront the nurse and gather more evidence to prove my fears. My mind raced with ideas, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in around me, suffocating my sanity. When the doctor made his rounds, I seized the moment. "Can you please tell me more about the night staff?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's something off about one of the nurses. She keeps giving me my medication, but I don't think it's just painkillers." He glanced at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "You're just coming out of surgery. It's normal to feel disoriented. Trust the staff. They're here to help you." His response felt dismissive, and I could sense the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Later that evening, as I lay in bed, I heard the familiar sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. My heart raced, and I braced myself for her arrival. I couldn't let her catch me off guard again. When she entered, I feigned sleep, watching her from the corners of my eyes. She moved with an eerie grace, as if gliding rather than walking. The syringe gleamed under the harsh light, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I had to get inside her head. I needed to confront her about the hallucinations and the odd feeling that enveloped me whenever she was around. When she reached my bedside, I suddenly sat up, locking eyes with her. "I know you're hiding something from me," I said, my voice shaky but determined. She froze for a moment, and I could see the surprise flicker across her face. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her tone shifting from calm to defensive. "I've seen things. Strange things when you're around," I continued, my heart pounding. "You're not just my nurse, are you? You're doing something to me." A smile crept across her face, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're imagining things. It's just the medication making you paranoid. You need to relax." "No," I shouted, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "I know what I'm experiencing. I've been documenting everything. You're giving me something else, something that isn't on the chart." She leaned closer, her expression shifting from concern to something darker. "You really shouldn't be asking questions like that. It's dangerous to dig too deep." With that, she swiftly injected the syringe into my fore. Panic surged through me as the drug coursed into my system. I fought to stay conscious, my vision blurring as I struggled against the tide of heaviness pulling me down. "Just relax," she cooed, her voice almost melodic. "You'll feel much better soon." I tried to push against the wave of sedation, but it was no use. My limbs felt heavy, and darkness threatened to consume me. In my fading consciousness, I heard her whisper, "You're safer this way." When I finally managed to open my eyes again, I was in a different room, darker, more confined. Panic surged as I realized I was alone. I tried to sit up, but my body felt leaden, as if shackled by an invisible force. My heart raced as I frantically looked around. There were no windows, no familiar sights, only shadows that danced along the walls. It was a nightmare. The last thing I remembered was her face, twisted in a grin, as she pushed the syringe into my arm. I struggled against the restraints, panic clawing at my throat. "Help! Someone help me!" I screamed, my voice echoing in the silence. The door creaked open, and to my horror, It was her, the nurse. She stepped into the room, her expression serene, but the glint in her eyes was anything but comforting. "You shouldn't have fought me," she said, her voice eerily calm. "You need to learn your place." "What have you done to me?" I gasped, struggling to comprehend my surroundings. "Let me go." "Soon you'll understand," she replied, almost cheerfully. "This is for your own good." As she turned to leave, I felt the weight of despair wash over me. I knew I had to escape. Whatever she was planning, I couldn't let it happen. I had to find a way out before it was too late. In the darkness, my mind raced with possibilities. I had to focus, to strategize. If I could get to my phone or find another nurse, I might have a chance. But first, I needed to bide my time, to act when she least expected it. The fight wasn't over. I would not become another victim of her twisted games. I would find a way to break free from this hellish nightmare. The nurse's calm demeanor unsettled me. I could feel her presence lingering in the room, even after she left. Panic gripped my chest as I struggled against the restraints, searching for a way out. The darkness felt oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I needed to think clearly. My phone. It might still be in my belongings. I strained to remember where I had last seen it. I recalled placing it in the pocket of my hospital gown when I was wheeled into the surgery room. If I could just get my hands on it, I could call for help. But first, I had to find a way to free myself. I flexed my wrists against the restraints, testing their strength. They were tight, but I noticed the edges of the fabric were fraying. If I could manage to pull hard enough, I might be able to loosen them. As I worked on getting free, my mind raced with memories of the nurse's actions. Her eyes, cold and calculating, her smile masking something far more sinister. I felt bile rise in my throat, a mix of fear and anger propelling me forward. I refused to become her next victim. After what felt like an eternity of struggling, I felt the restraints give just a little. My heart raced with hope as I continued to pull, slowly inching my way to freedom. The sound of footsteps echoed outside my room, causing me to freeze. I held my breath, straining to listen. The door creaked open, and I quickly lay back down, pretending to be unconscious. My heart pounded in my chest as I heard the familiar voice of the nurse. "You're going to be just fine," she cooed, her tone unsettlingly soothing. "Just let the medicine do its work." I risked a glance through my eyelashes, seeing her move about the room, checking monitors and adjusting my foreline. I waited, my heart pounding, until she stepped closer to the door, and I felt the moment was right. As soon as she turned her back to me, I pulled with all my might, the fabric finally giving way. I slipped my wrists free and quickly sat up, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The adrenaline surged through me, sharpening my senses as I assessed my surroundings. I glanced around the small room, searching for an exit. There was a window, but it was too high to reach. I needed to get out of this room before she returned. Quietly, I opened the door, peeking into the dimly lit hallway. To my relief, it was empty. I stepped into the corridor, my heart racing with each sound echoing through the halls. I quickly moved towards the nearest exit signs, praying they would lead me to freedom. As I turned the corner, I heard muffled voices coming from the nurse's station. My stomach twisted in knots as I crept closer, the reality of my situation hitting me like a punch to the gut. They were discussing me, and I couldn't let them find me. Just then, I spotted a fire exit door at the end of the hall. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead, and darted toward it. I reached for the handle, my heart racing, and pushed it open. A rush of cool air hit my face as I stepped outside into the night. But my relief was short-lived. The nurse's voice echoed behind me, growing closer. "You can't escape," she shouted, her tone laced with fury. "You don't know what you're doing." I sprinted across the parking lot, the sound of my heart pounding in my ears, desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. I spotted my car, and the sight filled me with renewed determination. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking as I desperately tried to unlock the door. As I climbed inside, I heard her footsteps pounding behind me. I quickly started the engine, the sound roaring to life, and slammed the car into gear. Just as I was about to pull away, I caught a glimpse of her in the rear-view mirror. Her face twisted in rage, and for a moment I was frozen in fear. But I couldn't let that stop me. I stepped on the gas and sped out of the parking lot, the tires screeching against the pavement. The adrenaline surged through my veins, propelling me forward. As I drove into the night, I felt a mix of relief and terror wash over me. I had escaped, but the memory of that nurse, the shadow of her twisted smile, haunted me. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see her figure lurking behind me, but the road was empty. I didn't know what she had planned for me, but I knew one thing for certain: I would never return to that hospital. The nightmare wasn't over, it had only just begun. I could feel her presence still lingering, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters were the faces of those we trust.
The Night Nurse.
I was admitted to the hospital for what was supposed to be a routine surgery. A simple procedure, they said. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. Just a few days of discomfort, a bit of recovery, and then I'd be back to my life. The hospital was one of those old, cold, sterile places where the walls seemed to have absorbed decades of whispers, beeping machines, and the quiet rustling of nurses' shoes. It felt lifeless, yet somehow full of unsettling memories. The surgery itself went smoothly, or so the doctors assured me. I was groggy from the anesthesia when they wheeled me back to my room, a small, dimly lit space on the third floor. They told me I'd need to stay overnight for observation, just to make sure everything was fine. I was too tired to argue. As the hours passed, I drifted in and out of sleep, the hum of machines in the background offering a strange sense of comfort. Then came the first night. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. I wasn't sure what had roused me. Maybe it was the painkillers wearing off, or perhaps it was the odd feeling of being watched. The room was dim, only the faint glow from the hallway creeping under the door. I tried to get comfortable, shifting in the stiff bed, when I noticed movement just outside my room. There she was, a nurse. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. She wore the standard white uniform, and her hair was tied back in a tight bun. She moved slowly, almost too slowly, pushing a metal cart with no sound. But something about her made me uneasy. I couldn't pinpoint it at the time, but there was a strangeness in the way she walked, the way her eyes stayed fixed ahead, as if she were following a path no one else could see. I watched as she disappeared down the hallway, her figure fading into the shadows. I thought about calling out to her, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the pain, or maybe I was just too tired to care. Whatever the reason, I closed my eyes and forced myself to drift back to sleep, convincing myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But the feeling lingered, the sense that something wasn't right. The next morning, when the day shift nurses came to check on me, I mentioned the woman I'd seen during the night. I expected them to nod, maybe tell me she was one of the night staff making her rounds. But instead, They exchanged confused glances. "There's no one assigned to this wing at night," one of the nurses said, her voice casual, but her eyes told a different story. "Our night shift staff only covers the emergency and ICU departments." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I wanted to believe they were mistaken, that maybe I had misread the situation. But deep down, I knew something was off. My mind kept replaying the way she moved, the way she seemed to glide down the hallway without a sound. I tried to push the thought away, telling myself it was probably just a mix of medication and my imagination. But that night, as darkness settled over the hospital again, I found myself wide awake, waiting for something I couldn't explain. That second night was different. I wasn't groggy from the medication this time. I was fully aware, lying in the uncomfortable hospital bed, my senses sharp despite the dim lighting and the quiet hum of machines around me. I couldn't sleep, no matter how hard I tried. Something was gnawing at me, a feeling I couldn't shake. Around 2 a.m., it happened again. I heard the faint sound of wheels rolling across the floor, that unmistakable creak of the metal cart. My body stiffened as my eyes snapped open, and there she was, the same nurse from the night before. But now I could see her more clearly, and I immediately noticed what had been bothering me before. She had no shadow. I know how that sounds, like a trick of the light or my mind playing games with me in the dark. But it wasn't. The hallway was dimly lit, the glow from the overhead lights casting soft shadows on everything, the chairs, the 4 stands, even the doorframe. But not her. She moved silently, gliding down the corridor, her feet barely making a sound on the polished floor, and yet there was no shadow following her. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up slightly in bed, trying to convince myself that I wasn't seeing what I thought I was. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, she was still there, moving slowly from room to room, pushing that cart. Her face was as expressionless as before, her movements robotic, like she was performing the same task over and over again, without thought or feeling. My heart raced as I debated what to do. Should I call out to her? Should I hit the call button for the nurse on duty? But something deep inside me, some primal instinct, told me to stay quiet. I don't know why, but I had this overwhelming feeling that I didn't want her to notice me. Not yet. She continued down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows at the far end. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, but all I could hear was the low hum of the hospital. My body was tense, my skin crawling with unease. It was as if the air around me had grown heavier, colder. I lay back down, my mind racing with questions. Who was she? Why didn't she have a shadow? And why was she walking the halls of a wing that supposedly had no night staff? My stomach twisted with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see. The next morning, I couldn't stop myself from asking the nurse who came to check on me. That nurse last night. I saw her again, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. The nurse looked at me, puzzled. What nurse? The one who was doing rounds in the middle of the night, I explained, my heart starting to pound again. The one with the cart. Her face darkened slightly, but she tried to brush it off. There's no one scheduled to do rounds here at night. Just the emergency staff. You must have been dreaming. No, I said firmly, my voice rising. I wasn't dreaming. I saw her. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if to make sure no one else was listening. I'm telling you, there's no one working that shift. But, she paused, then lowered her voice. Some of the older patients say they've seen something like that before. A woman in white, doing rounds at night. But it's just stories. You're probably just tired. Her words lingered in my mind long after she left the room. I couldn't accept that it was just a story. I knew what I had seen, and the way she spoke, the way her eyes flickered with unease, told me she knew something more. Something she wasn't telling me. That night, I knew I had to stay awake. I had to see her again. I needed answers. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. It wasn't just a hunch, it was a deep, crawling sense of dread that settled into my bones the moment the sun dipped below the horizon. Every sound in the hospital felt amplified. The distant murmur of voices, the soft clattering of medical equipment, the occasional echo of footsteps in the hallway. But none of it distracted me from what I knew was coming. I kept my eyes trained on the door. Every nerve in my body was tense, waiting for the now familiar sound of that cart, waiting for her. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I had to see her again, even though the thought made my skin crawl. Something about her wasn't just wrong. It was terrifying in a way that felt ancient, like a dark secret buried in the walls of this place. Around 2 a.m., the hallway outside my room fell unnervingly silent. I knew it was time. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest, my fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. And then, there it was, the soft, barely audible creak of wheels. The sound seemed to crawl its way down the corridor, slow and steady. My breath caught in my throat. She came into view again, gliding past the door like before, her cart moving as if weightless. Her face was still a mask of emotionless calm, her eyes vacant, staring ahead like she was sleepwalking. This time, though, I noticed something else. Her lips were moving, just barely, as if she were whispering to herself. I leaned forward, trying to hear, but there was no sound. Just the eerie movement of her mouth, mouthing words that never made it past her lips. I wanted to look away, to pretend she wasn't real, but I couldn't. It was like I was trapped, unable to break free from her silent presence. And then she stopped, right outside my room. She turned her head, slowly, impossibly slowly, and looked directly at me. Her eyes were dark, hollow, like two empty pits that seemed to pull the warmth out of the air. My breath hitched. I felt a cold, paralyzing fear wash over me, freezing me in place. For a second, we just stared at each other, and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, without a sound, she started to move toward my door. My body reacted before my brain could catch up. I hit the nurse call button repeatedly, panic surging through me. The light above my bed blinked, signaling the alarm, but nothing happened. No one came. The nurse's footsteps, if I could even call them that, were so soft they were almost non-existent. But I knew she was getting closer. I pressed myself against the bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I could see her shadow now. No, not a shadow. A dark, empty space where a shadow should have been. She reached the door, and I could see her hand, pale, bony, almost translucent, slowly curling around the edge of the doorframe. I couldn't take it anymore. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice trembling with fear. My words echoed back at me in the quiet room, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, her hollow eyes fixed on mine, her hand still resting on the doorframe as if she were deciding whether to come in or not. Suddenly, the door to my room burst open, and one of the day nurses rushed in, her face pale and frantic. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" she asked, scanning the room. I looked back to the door, expecting to see her, the night nurse, still standing there. But she was gone. The hallway was empty, just as it had been the first night. No trace of her. No sign that she had ever been there. I saw her again, I managed to say, my voice weak. The nurse. She was here. She was right at my door. The day nurse's face tightened, but she tried to keep her expression neutral. "You're sure?" she asked quietly, her tone betraying the concern she was trying to hide. "Yes," I whispered. She looked at me. She was going to come into my room. The nurse glanced at the doorway, her eyes narrowing, as if she expected something, or someone, to appear. But the hallway remained empty. After a moment, she stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I'll stay with you for a while," she said. "Just in case." Her words didn't comfort me. In fact, they made me feel worse. Because the way she said it, the way her eyes darted nervously toward the door, it was as if she knew something. Something she wasn't telling me. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. And I knew that whatever was happening, it wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the night before. The image of the nurse standing in my doorway, her hollow eyes fixed on me, wouldn't leave my mind. It was as if her presence had burned itself into my brain. I needed answers, and I was tired of the staff brushing me off. Something wasn't right here, and I was determined to find out what it was. After breakfast, I asked one of the younger nurses if I could talk to the head nurse. She hesitated for a moment, but eventually agreed to fetch her. A few minutes later, an older woman with a stern expression walked into my room. She looked like she had seen it all. Years of late shifts, emergencies, and difficult patients had hardened her. "You wanted to speak with me?" she asked, her voice flat, professional. I took a deep breath. "Yes. I've been seeing someone, at night. A nurse. She walks the halls, but no one seems to know who she is. I've seen her twice now, and last night she stopped right outside my door. She looked right at me." The head nurse's face didn't change, but I could tell she was listening closely. "And you're sure this wasn't a dream? Or perhaps a side effect of the medication?" "I'm sure," I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "I've been off the heavy meds for 2 days. This isn't a dream. I saw her clearly. She doesn't have a shadow. And there's something wrong with her." The head nurse glanced at the door, then back at me. She seemed to weigh her next words carefully. "What you're describing, it's not the first time we've heard about this nurse. But I need you to understand, we don't have anyone working that shift on this floor at night. Only emergency staff, and they don't make rounds." I swallowed hard, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. "Then who is she?" The head nurse sighed, and for the first time, her mask of professionalism slipped. There was something like fear behind her eyes. She pulled up a chair and sat down, leaning closer as if not wanting anyone else to hear. "There's an old story," she began quietly. "A story about a nurse who used to work here many years ago. Back when this hospital was smaller, just a few floors. Her name was Margaret Ellison. She worked the night shift, and by all accounts, she was a dedicated nurse. But something happened. I felt my skin prickle." "What happened?" "She started to change," the head nurse continued, her voice low. "At first, it was subtle. She became distant, distracted. Then, patients started complaining that she wasn't checking on them properly. Some said they'd see her just standing at their door, staring. She stopped speaking to the staff, too. And then, one night, Vanished. Vanished. I echoed, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The head nurse nodded. They found her cart in the hallway, abandoned. Her shoes were still there, neatly placed beside it. But she was gone. They searched the entire hospital, the grounds, even the nearby woods. She was never found. I shuddered. And people still see her? Sometimes, she said. But it's always at night, and always in this wing of the hospital. The older staff know the story, but we don't talk about it much. We don't want to scare the patients. She paused, then added, but if you've seen her, and you're sure of it, then you're not the first. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. But why? Why does she keep appearing? What does she want? The head nurse shook her head, standing up from the chair. We don't know. But patients who've seen her, they've all said the same thing. They felt like she was waiting for something. Or someone. I felt a lump in my throat, the weight of her words settling on me. Waiting for someone? What do you mean? She didn't answer directly, but her eyes held mine, filled with something I could only describe as warning. Be careful, she said softly. If you see her again, don't engage. Don't try to speak to her. Just press the call button and wait for us. Whatever she's waiting for, you don't want to be the one to find out. With that, she left the room, leaving me alone with the chilling knowledge that whatever I had seen wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was something far older, something that had been haunting this hospital long before I'd arrived. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time a nurse walked past my door, I tensed, expecting her to return. The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of the story I had just been told. And I couldn't help but wonder, was she really waiting for someone? And if she was, could it be me? That night, the hospital felt different, charged with an energy that prickled my skin. I had barely slept the previous night, and the shadows in my room seemed to thicken as darkness fell. The clock ticked on the wall, each second stretching into an eternity. I found myself glued to the bed, heart racing, eyes glued to the door. When the clock struck 2, an all-too-familiar sound echoed through the hallway, the soft creaking of wheels. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to see her again, but I knew she would come. The unease coiled tighter within me, and I could feel the pulse of fear pounding in my ears. She appeared in the doorway, just as she had before. But this time, I was ready. I remembered the head nurse's warning, don't engage. Just press the call button. But as I stared into her dark, hollow eyes, I felt a strange compulsion pulling me closer to her, as if her very presence was drawing me in. Please, I whispered, my voice trembling. What do you want from me? The nurse didn't respond, her lips moving soundlessly again, as if whispering a secret I couldn't hear. But I felt it. The air shifted, and a deep chill settled around me. I could sense that this moment was different. There was a weight to it, a promise of revelation. Suddenly, she stepped forward, and the room seemed to darken around her. I scrambled backward, hitting the bed's headboard. Stay back! I shouted, but my voice echoed in the empty space, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. The nurse paused, her head tilting slightly as if considering my words. I watched, terrified and entranced, as her eyes flickered with something like recognition. Then, without warning, she turned and glided out of the room, her cart trailing behind her. Against my better judgment, I got up from the bed and followed. My legs felt shaky beneath me, but I had to know. I had to understand what was happening. I stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the cold tile beneath my feet sending shivers up my spine. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as I followed her figure down the corridor. She moved with an otherworldly grace, gliding silently as I trailed behind her, heart racing. As I turned the corner, I saw her stop in front of a door I hadn't noticed before. It was old, worn, the paint peeling and chipped. It didn't match the rest of the hospital, as if it belonged to another time. I felt a strange pull toward it, an inexplicable connection. She stood there, motionless, staring at the door. I approached cautiously, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. "What's in there?" I whispered, hoping for an answer. But she remained silent, her vacant eyes fixed on the door, her expression inscrutable. My curiosity overwhelmed my fear, and I reached for the doorknob. It felt cold beneath my fingertips, sending another shiver down my spine. As I turned it, the door creaked open, revealing a darkened room filled with shadows. I hesitated, glancing back at the nurse, but she remained still, as if urging me to step inside. I took a deep breath and crossed the threshold. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something more sinister. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out rows of empty hospital beds, each one draped with dusty sheets. It was a forgotten ward, long abandoned and neglected. But that wasn't what caught my attention. At the far end of the room, on one of the beds, lay an old photograph. I walked closer, heart pounding, and picked it up. It was a faded image of a group of nurses standing proudly in their uniforms. In the center stood a familiar face, the night nurse. A chill washed over me as I recognized her. But there was more. Behind her, a small placard read, "In memory of Margaret Ellison." Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The stories, the warnings, the isolation of this wing. Margaret wasn't just a ghost. She was a presence tied to this place, lost in time. And now, somehow, she was waiting for me. "Margaret," I breathed, feeling the weight of her sorrow fill the room. "What happened to you?" As if responding to my question, the lights flickered, and I felt a rush of air swirl around me. The room grew colder, and for a brief moment, I could hear whispers, a cacophony of voices, soft and haunting, echoing through the stillness. Then I heard it, a faint, desperate call that pierced through the noise. "Help me!" My heart raced as the realization sank in. Margaret wasn't haunting this place out of malice. She was trapped, lost in a cycle of despair, waiting for someone to set her free. And now I had the chance to help her. I turned to face her, who had stepped into the doorway, watching me with those hollow eyes filled with an unsettling mixture of hope and desperation. "I will help you," I promised, my voice steadier now. "But you have to show me how." In that moment, the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, as if a weight had been released. The whispers softened, and I felt an unexpected warmth wash over me. I didn't know how I would help her, but I knew I couldn't leave her here, trapped in this never-ending cycle of silence. As I reached for her hand, I felt a surge of determination. Together, we would unravel the mystery of her past and finally free her from the darkness that had consumed her for so long.